Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 74 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Jerry and Curt today for episode 74, Affect and Helping Organizations. So we're going back to, Curt rounded us up some great articles we're going to really look at trauma-informed workplaces and different ways to think about some of the research out there on healthy workplaces, leadership approaches, and really, again, putting our trauma-informed lens on that. So you can go to the show notes at traumainformedlens.org and get the article packed full of information. This one was packed. Lots of stuff. Lots of stuff. A book or two or three or 18 in one article. So lots of good stuff. If you've never read anything on affect in organizations, this is the article you need to start with. So as always, we start with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Curt, let's start with you this week. What are you thinking about?
I had just a wonderful conversation with faculty at the Colorado State University Social Research Center, and was just really excited about the potential of partnering with them on some kind of local impact projects, certainly related to child welfare and effectiveness in the foster care system, and about even, when we talk about what we've been talking about in terms of using some physiological measures, there was some interest around that as well. So I get real jazzed by that kind of stuff. Even if it doesn't pan out, like I'll get something out of being excited about what might happen for a little while. So I was really just enjoying that and was feeling like we had done some really good things for individuals, down to the people that the clinicians that I've been involved with have been treating, and what a difference it's making for those individuals one at a time in their ability to socially engage with others, their ability to be aware of their own internal state and reflective about their own internal state, and was just feeling kind of proud of that and happy about that kind of work. So it was a real bright spot for me for the week.
Very cool. Jerry, what about you?
I'm trying to cope with all the challenges that I hear in the news all the time, and trying to be mindful. So I picked up Jon Kabat-Zinn's Mindfulness for All, Transforming the World, and I've been listening to it in terms of, one is trying to maintain some sense of hope about some things, but also not being in some ways organized by that, right? Is that trying to bring a mindful, kind of grounded perspective on where we're at. And he does a really good job of integrating current events through a mindful lens. And I think it's a really nice book to kind of read. Although when I listen to him on tape, I find that I become very mindful and sleepy. He has a very soothing voice, but it's been helpful. So I reckon it's the I think it's the fourth in the series that he has. But this is really what he calls the body's politics. So kind of bringing your own energy to rather than having that external energy organize you bring energy to it. So it's a nice escape from the things that are going on in the world today.
Very cool. Mine this week is I scheduled a session for cranial. You might have to help me with cranial sacral therapy this week. Through our heart rate variability talks and my sort of current obsession around related issues.
Your head looks different this week.
Yeah. Yes, I'm a little taller.
Therapy work.
Yeah, I found a great local, Teresa Wright, actually, great local. She's also a rolfer. I can never say that. I feel like I say rolfer. I just can't say rolfing. So
say it again.
A rolfing. And she's also trained with Peter Levine as well. So she has got I love living in Denver sometimes, and I'm sure there's other places around the country, but sometimes when you're looking for like a really particular expertise, usually you can find it in Denver, like 10 minutes away from your house. And so I just had an amazing conversation with her. It's kind of cool because she was sort of around Pat Ogden, Vanderkalt, really early on. And I'm also rereading The Body Keeps Score by Vanderkalt as well, just kind of with the current lens that I have after our heart rate variability and all that thing. And so just like some of the things that I was just listening to that he said, she was at some of those of early events of trauma. So I kind of got this great therapy session, and then we just talked and kind of felt like I got a little piece of eyewitness to history during the early days as well. So I'm excited. It was really, I don't know if I've been that relaxed in a long time, and it's just kind of someone holding your head in certain ways, and really cool stuff. So I'll keep everybody updated because I'm definitely going back for more, maybe get some rolfing in there as well. So yeah, then I'll learn to say it without having to sound like a dog barking. So so Curt, this was an article, my friend. Well, where do you want to start with this one?
Well,
how'd you feel when you were?
There were a couple of, I think, kind of key points in here as an overarching kind of thing. And one was really in kind of even the first line of the article that I thought was a very important point made early on, is that when you think about what an organization is, as viewing it as its component parts, is that organizations are comprised of interdependent relationships among its parts, whether or not it's a boss to a subordinate, whether it's not a team member. So all of these kind of web of interdependent relationships, it was a really key point, I thought, that was critical to this idea of how to understand the way that affective processes or emotions impact the entire organization, that they have effects much greater than any one of the individual areas of an organization, any one of the individual department or a process or a system. None of those things are independent of one another, and affect or emotional states can certainly be transmitted across all of those, between individuals, across individuals, between departments, across departments. So I know I certainly have had the impact on me of reading this article several times. That the first time I read it, I was kind of like, how in the world am I going to keep all of this in my head all the time? Like, how am I going to be aware of this and be responding to all of these things all the time? And I have found that the longer you do it and the longer you keep making effort to do it, the easier it does become. That you get a sense of it starts to become more of a consciously incompetent process to being at least a consciously competent process. And so I kind of want to give that to people who may be reading this for the first time and wondering, how am I going to do this? I'm a leader, or if I'm a follower, how is my emotional state or the affect that I'm experiencing going to impact those around me? I thought that was just a really key point. Another takeaway for me here was the tie-in to what we experience every single day in our organizational social lives, and how much affect is involved in all of those things. Little things like deadlines, which is a constant within organizational social processes, and that there is a lot of emotion tied up in deadlines. And that has a big impact on how we function on a moment-to-moment basis. Another key point that came up was group projects. I don't know anybody who can't think back to a group project in college or in high school or at work where there wasn't a lot of affect involved in that group process, both positive affect and negative affect. Both of those are happening in those. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of energy that can be gained from group projects. And there is also a lot of frustration that can be involved in having to collaborate with multiple people and understand different ways of thinking that may challenge your own. And so being aware of those, the importance of managing and being aware of affective processes in those things was I thought, a really great point. Even something as simple as human resources or HR processes. There's a lot of emotion tied up in those things, like annual evaluations and performance reviews and employee selection. There's a lot of feeling, a lot of emotion involved in those processes. And I think, of course, the author's point here is that when we don't talk about the emotional components or the affective components of those processes, we're missing something really important in understanding how those processes can be made more effective and sometimes how they break down. Finally, of course, motivation is just huge. When we think about what's so important and like what do we do in our organizational lives, being motivated to work towards a common goal or work towards the goals of the organizations that we're a part of, and think about that even as social groups that we're a part of. That there's a lot of affect in terms of motivational processes in there. And love the ties into decision-making, that emotions play into decision-making. Oftentimes, as a put on my administrator hat early on, I remember trying to distance myself as much as I could from the emotional part of decision-making, and going through the process of reading this article. And honestly, sitting across from Jerry for 5 years, listening to what I needed to pay attention to, made me okay with kind of leaning into the emotional parts of those things and getting a view, a more holistic view of the entire decision that you're making and all the different impacts that it could have. Kind of a personal story about that. I remember being a leader early on and getting really overwhelmed with the amount of affect involved in leading others. And at times I would find myself really trying hard to distance myself from that because it was uncomfortable for me. And I had to really do a lot of work around understanding both sides of the positive affective processes and the negative affective processes involved there, and being okay with both of them, and that they're both needed. So that kind of put me in, and there are lots of different sections here that I would kind of like to go through a little bit, but just to hit on some of the high points too. The last one that I thought is a takeaway from all of the different effects of emotions that this article talks about is the key of balance. That it's not necessarily that you need to create positive affect for everybody all the time. That's not what this article is really kind of talking about. It is that both sides of the affective circumplex that is also talked about in this article, both the high pleasant and the low pleasant are both need to be balanced all the time. And it's not that one is necessarily, you want to get rid of one all the time and only have, high pleasant all the time. It's the balance between the two that I think is a critical takeaway from the article. So that's kind of where I started as an overview. Anything either one of you two would add to some of the takeaways or high?
That was only the first page, right?
In the vignette at the very, you could get all that from the little vignette.
Yeah.
Matt, your thoughts as a your expertise there is in leadership and kind of thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I almost just say yes to this article. I think it was my personal journey around kind of this topic was, I found out I could double major. I was in counseling psychology and taking 4 more classes. I could get nonprofit leadership, double masters. And so I took my first business class around probably 1999, and just realized that the business realm did not get psychology. In 99, they were talking about Freud and Myers-Briggs. And not that there's anything wrong, inherently about those, but they weren't even talking about behavioral stuff, much less cognitive behavioral stuff. So, there was just this really disconnect. Then I realized a lot of folks in mental health don't understand business whatsoever either. So it was kind of a mutual thing. And so, as I graduated from my counseling psych degree, I jumped right into an MBA program. And, it really, I've been kind of holding these two pieces my entire career. And, I feel like I have a 2-day training on this topic, so I will try not to speak for 2 days on it. But I think my conclusion after reading a lot of the books, if not all of them that this article is based upon over the years, is that my leadership model, at least how I introduce it, is effective leadership and intellectual leadership. And my argument is that if you don't have an emotionally healthy organization, and we can talk about organizational culture as kind of a manifestation of a lot of that emotional effective health, then you're not going to get good performance. And I think, especially around the Gallup 12 study coming out with First Break All the Rules in about 2000, we've seen the business arena start to really wake up to this in a way that I think is very powerful. So, like I said, this article is kind of like, mirrors my, research into this area. And I think, the one step further that this article doesn't really touch upon, just because the audience it's intended for, is what happens when trauma walks through your door every day. So, and all the affect that our patients, students, clients walk through the door with. So if affect is a determinant of, and what about vicarious trauma, secondary trauma? And this is why you could almost put a hyper, this article is kind of times 2, times 3 plus, I think, for helping organizations as well. So yeah, lots of thoughts on this. But again, it just kind of really mirrors just a lot of the reading and research I've done over the last 18, 19 years now.
Anything you'd add, Jerry?
I think really just kind of compliment what Matt said, is that this is a trauma-informed lens, right? And so we have to kind of take a look at this article, but look at it through a trauma-informed perspective and really understand that each of those areas, and so when you think about emotional regulation, if you think about decision-making, if you think about being creative versus repetitively engaging in the same behaviors, to kind of looking at that, is that trauma interferes with all of those functions. Right. And so in a way, going back to Darwin, to kind of looking at, the work of Jacques Hansek, to kind of understanding emotions, to kind of looking at that, is that emotions really are an action tendency, right? Is that they move us to action. And so there's this action tendency that has been kind of systematically organized over centuries, right? And that it's goal directed. Right? And so when we have an emotion, there's something either internally or externally stimulating us to, in some ways, engage in some type of behavior, to kind of look at that. And I think what this article really looked at is that when we're conscious of that, and you've talked about this before, Curt, is that we could take those emotions and symbolically simulate what our actions would actually cause, and then make some decision about how to kind of respond to those emotions, right? To kind of look at that. that ability really gets disrupted due to trauma. And so, in a way, those lower level emotions that we are born with, sadness and anger and joy and disgust and surprise, all those things that we share with other mammals, originate in a reflexive response to the environment, right? And what this really talked about is a well-functioning, healthy, productive environment has this ability to regulate and define it as emotional intelligence. Well, the challenge that Matt described to maintain that means that you have to constantly be attending to that issue. That it's not enough to just assume, because in a way that there's things that are going to be activated in me at an unconscious level that I'm not even aware of. And I have to be in a spot to be able to stop and be reflective, both about the clients I serve, but about myself. So, Matt's thought about this has to be magnified. Really, I can't say enough. And also that the individuals we're working with, this is the very issue that they come to us lacking, right? And so we have to, in some ways, not be organized by there. And yet, what we keep talking about is this empathetic connection. So I have to resonate with their internal state, and then I have to go back and be emotionally intelligent and make good decisions and kind of come out of it. So you think about the challenge in a trauma-informed environment, and it takes a lot more than going to, as Matt said, a 2-hour training to really become trauma-informed.
Yeah, the complexity of the processes is really kind of an interesting point, I think, as you think about shifting organizational metaphors from a more mechanistic approach to a more living systems approach. As you think about problem solving within an organization, using a mechanistic approach would be all parts are necessarily relatively equal. And if there's a problem, then we need to replace the part, as opposed to all the parts are interdependent and related to one another. And if there's a problem, we might need to change something other than just the part. It may not be the part that's the problem, which is just a more complicated way of looking at the organization, more holistic way of looking at an organization.
And I think that the article kind of alluded to, but really as this affect travels throughout the organization, there's less awareness of where this affect came from. I feel it, but I don't have any connection to it. So then I've got to make up some story to explain this distressful state, right? So it must be my supervisor who's creating this in me, or it must be that the referral sources, they don't really get it, right? It's like we get it. And it goes very much back to the book I'm reading right now, is how do we stay mindful and learn to observe, tolerate, and modulate those states before we move to action?
Yeah, that is the major challenge, right? What you're saying is that when the major functions of affect for living systems, say a human being or an organization, is to organize action.
Right.
And not acting is a lot of effort.
Right.
That takes a lot of effort. And
right. I think Sandra Bloom's word is this collective disturbances.
Right. It leads right into one of the areas that I wanted to talk about and get your input on a lot, which is the ideas of emotion regulation and emotional labor, and how much emotional labor is involved in the helping fields. Some of the examples from the article I thought were just awesome because they were not in the helping field really at all. But even surface acting, and the size of the one I really loved was the size of the cashier's smile increased purchasing behavior. And it was correlated with the size of the smile of the customer and with the customer's experience. But tied it really well, I think, to this idea of how emotional labor is involved in what we do every single day, whether you're selling stuff in a coffee shop or even more so, working with individuals who need you to resonate with them emotionally, as you were saying, Jerry, how important that is, and that's a part of the job that we need to be paying for. If we're paying employees to do a certain job, then that should be like written into what it is that we're actually looking for and what we're actually purchasing, say, when we are buying services from an employee or a part of our organization. I think that was a really great point to put into this article from a very business related perspective. And Matt, point well taken, that in the helping fields, especially with individuals who have not had that kind of connective, attuned experience, that producing that is critical to success. So I thought that was a great section and had some really important.
Totally agree. And I'm glad that made it in there. I don't think it's something we talk nearly enough. And just to throw out a little advocacy piece, as we see jobs where emotional labor often becomes more and more intense, we often see the pay drop as well, which I think is a bunch of BS in my opinion. But you know, I think, you know, as I train and I hold this space and I'm very upfront about it, is if you hear me train about motivational interviewing and even trauma-informed care, I talk a lot about empathy. And in many ways, empathy is a sort of vulnerability to the pain and suffering of another. It's not like we have to feel what they're feeling, but we've got to be present with that pain. We've got to be present with their suffering. And then with motivational interviewing, because of the research, I'm like, okay, you can't jump in and fix the problem, right? That's not your job. That actually slows the change process down. We have to create a partnership with them and help them elicit their own reasons for change. So you might end a session where, you know, somebody's going to go out and not leave the abuser, not stop using substances, and you're afraid they're going to overdose. I'm sure all three of us, probably more than we like to remember, have had someone told us they might go out and commit suicide. And, you know, so there's this emotional labor, and then there's like this vulnerability and exposure to trauma and stress on top of it. Now, this is the fire we signed up to walk into doing this work. But so, you know, on one hand, it's like, okay, you're walking into this fire every day, and even the best firefighters sometimes can get burned. So it's like, why the hyper focus on self-care in our field, and why I really think when I developed a trauma-informed model, you know, my two foundations of that was not knowledge about trauma. That obviously was the third component, but it was really effective leadership and self-care. Because if you don't have those two things, you're going to have an emotionally dysregulated worker who's not going to provide quality services over any given length of period of time. So, you know, again, that emotional labor, there's an intensity to our version of that, which, you know, again, it's fire we walk into, but also, you know, sets us up for, you know, vicarious secondary trauma, just compassion fatigue, and having to hear story after story after story. So I think it's important to acknowledge this. And like you said, it's like everything else in this article, it's that magnified version of what they're talking about.
You know, Matt, I think that as you talk, one of the things that comes to my mind is the difference between empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
And I think when we have an understanding that we're defining in some ways an emotion as an action tendency, right? Is that something either in the environment stimulates it or a state in us changes, right? And then we're moved to action. Well, part of that action is goal directed, which means that the final stage is completion, right? So if I'm hungry and I begin to have the sensation of hungry, then I start seeking food. It's not over till I get food and satisfy myself, right? And so when we're empathizing and resonating with another's experience, it creates that experience in us. And when you say our job isn't to fix it, well, that's not actually correct. Our job is to fix it, but we fix it by creating the resource in the individual. So if we frame it that our goal is to to increase the capacity of the individual, not to fix the emotion, then we can have completion. And I think that's where empathy moves over to compassion, is that when I feel like I can actually do something with this stuff I'm feeling, I don't get stuck in this kind of state that doesn't get finished or completed and leads to burnout or pain or disruption. So in some ways, I think motivational interview gives us a framework to understand how we are being effective, as opposed to somebody just saying it's not your job to fix it. It is, you're giving people a real good job that is about how I build resources in this person I'm interacting with, not about this particular. So I think that's a really important part of completing the cycle. And I think in leadership, that's where this issue of mission comes in. Is when we hold our mission of our why of why we're doing that, it helps us to tolerate these ups and downs, and to kind of look at that. And I think that's a really important part of leadership and affective management, is to kind of have this foot in the present, but also a foot in where we have a mission to achieve, to kind of manage this. And how did we do with that today, right? We may have had it down, but how are we doing with this bigger vision to kind of look at? So I think a lot of these are really important concepts when we're working with trauma survivors who in some ways get lost in the moment. They get flooded with their emotions. They don't become really guides to actions. They don't become guides to completion. They become just an overwhelming re-experiences of a sense of helplessness and pain and despair.
There's too many of them to really guide action.
Exactly.
It's just too diversified.
Right. So I think that's where, your teaching of this, or you're teaching a trauma-informed, is hopefully to help people feel like they are being impactful and productive, just not being guided by, oh my God, I got to turn off that emotion because it's painful.
The article actually talked about it, which I'm glad that they did. And we've actually talked about it in some of our heart rate variability episodes in terms of emotion regulation. The two kind of key processes are reappraisal and suppression. Right? And I think, Jerry, what I'm hearing when you're talking is really the difference between those two things.
Right.
Are you just suppressing the emotion? And you may have to do that temporarily, and you may need to do some surface acting temporarily. But the long-term goal is to reappraise it, to be able to then change what action urge you have, or get to the level of completing the cycle of that action urge in a different way than what your original urge may have been.
Right. And I think too often, and you've seen this, both of you, is in treatment centers, we get caught up in this repetition of these emotion cycle, as opposed to what do we need to get to some completion? What is it that we need to either resolve, or we need to achieve, or we need to get to some sense? Us just being in here and emoting isn't really helping us to kind of get to where we want to get to.
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's, you probably have different language and different people, but really, they talk about these vehement emotions that just come up. And how many teams have you been on where, wow, we just kind of overwhelmed with what we're feeling, but at the end of it, we don't feel any better after we just said all this stuff.
Sure.
Right? So I think a leader's job is to kind of hear and validate that, and sometimes put some containment around that, and sometimes, but help people get to that. Let's get really productive and kind of move forward with kind of satisfying some of our goals, whatever those are. And that's where the team kind of looks at. So I thought it was a really nice article that gave us frameworks and understanding of each of those components. But I always get kind of, I don't know the word, I get kind of thinking about how, no matter what it is, how our brain wants to categorize things, right? We want to organize and categorize things, and then we can measure them.
Yeah.
kind of looking at that. And this article really did a great job of, well, here, let's put a category so all these kinds of things that really are in some ways different experiences, right?
Sometimes
so
they fit into the category.
high energy, positive, I really like being there, right? Somebody else, that's exhausting for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it leads into, I think, another really fascinating area, which is emotional contagion and collective affect. That's just one, I love that section. And I love a lot of the research about that. Certainly I was reading it and I could hear your voice in my head, Matt. I was waiting and I could hear it. I'm like, Curt, I wonder what you think about from a behavioral perspective. Shared emotion and collective affect.
I've held off on asking that question, but Curt, how do you feel about that? Well, because I mean, again, I'm pigeonholing you like I always do, but I love doing it. Like, you want to reward. I mean, how does the emotional? Because I mean, there is a level. I think, I was laughing when Jerry was saying it. I get tired of meetings where we just process to death, right? And we never seem to move anywhere forward. I think that's why, to me, intellectual leadership is just as important about, okay, we've got a goal to accomplish together. Now, sometimes you may want to sit in that emotion longer depending on what's going on, but I kind of wonder is like, as you think about it, as your position as a leader where, as I always say, leaders, and I say to people like in self-care, you got to get stuff done too. I mean, there is you got to get the shifts covered. If overnight calls off, you've got to find somebody maybe to work a double. So there's these two kind of competing sides. And I kind of wonder how you balance that, Curt, is where's that emotion come into play for you?
Yeah. I actually thought about that earlier today, and I learned it from Jerry. So here's my disclaimer, right? I learned this from Jerry. I will listen to hear when the inferences or the attributions that are being made for the problem start to go outside the room. And when they start to go outside the room, which are things that we cannot manage, then it's time to set some limits around it and bring it back.
You ever said that to a mental health therapist or social worker?
Right, when we start talking about the problem we're experiencing and that our solution to it is to try and manage another entity, it's now gone too far. Now we can't manage that, right? Like it's gone. So now it's time to bring it back and go, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to get our shifts covered? And how are we going to solve the problems that we can solve? And what are the things that we can do? And that's just how I balance it. I wait for that moment, and it doesn't mean like you stop it right then. Yeah. But that's when I start thinking, okay, how am I going to bring this back to something that we need to do and orient it to what our mission is? That's how I do it. And I learned that from talking to Jerry.
Yeah. That's a great script. Well, and I'll go a little on your island with this as well, is that one of the things that in my leadership research, which I think is very much tied to affective health, is we see that high recognition organizations actually well outperform low recognition organizations. So, now that's sort of maybe the different side of a reinforcer. It's not like, hey, if you do X, your pay is going to increase, 5% over last year or whatever. It's a little bit more fluid. Not everything is a great piece of work is seen necessarily in that real time. But I think, you look at the work about high recognition versus low recognition organizations and teams, and boy, do we thrive. There's some strategies around this. You want to throw I could have probably added another 300 pages of this, like with the growth mindset on top of that. You want to really recognize behavior, not who the person is in some other stretches. But you look at the research around recognition, and, so there is some like carrots there. But you see the same thing around high accountability as well. So, this is where, to me, that intellectual piece comes in once you get the emotional regulation. But those two aren't step one and step two in a lot of way, because, if we're working towards whether, Jerry says it's kind of the mission of why we're doing it. or maybe the vision of what we're striving to become greater than ourselves. You know, I always say when we get that, whether it's an individual or whether it's a team, a bad day becomes part of a larger process. So this is where I think a lot of folks, where a lack of business training sometimes in the helping professions can get around, because a lot of times, Curt, I think you're right. I get as frustrated as anybody, maybe not as frustrated as you, but pretty frustrated when all we're doing is just going over the same dead horse one more time and not getting to action, because I see definite, we need to improve in quality, and yet we're stuck. But we're stuck for a reason too. And I think that's the tricky part of being on teams, being in leadership. If I've got a group of people who are burned out or vicariously, secondarily traumatized, they're not going to be able to go very far. So this is the tricky part. And I've walked into the middle of teams who are train wrecks. And it's survival. And, you know, you've got to regulate, you've got to listen a lot before it's like, okay, let's take this little step forward, because they need to be heard. You know, especially if I'm hired as a new leader, you know, they've got to be heard. And when you balance that, I think I've seen really great things happen, but it's a hard thing to do, to keep. I want to just throw it out there. It's really hard, whether you're a member of a team or whether you're a leader, to keep a healthy, functional, high-performing unit together when they're spending a lot of their days either talking about trauma or feeling they're dealing with the effects of trauma. Not impossible, but I think we have to think about leadership in a different way. And I love this discussion because I think we're doing this. So we're doing something I don't think nearly enough helping organizations do. We're taking the business literature and putting, okay, what's this mean when trauma walks through your door and not a customer at Walmart or someone coming into the bank or someone working at a factory? There's challenges to all those environments. But I believe when you look at what we're talking about, the leading in our environments, trauma-informed environments, are some of the toughest jobs in leadership, up there maybe with military, law enforcement, criminal, you know, I put us up there with those categories.
Yeah.
So in my free association while you were talking, right, is I'm always trying to tie it back to our trauma lens.
Yeah.
And what I hear really is that this issue of individual but group window of tolerance, that when we're within our window of tolerance, we could be having an emotional reaction, we could do it, but we're able to stay socially engaged and engaged in the task. And that when that experience becomes too intense, the arousal level really becomes too high for me to be able to integrate information and integrate what's going on. What that gets manifested is I go outside the room, or I start blaming somebody, or I start right, or I get down in hyper as I feel hopeless and helpless, right? And so you as a leader are co-regulating, is that when they're within the window of tolerance, you're kind of just guiding and being with them. When they get out and they're outside the room, you said, I intervene and I bring them back to the task and what to do, and then they start. So this kind of relationship between where they're able to, as a group or an individual, regulate that emotional state and stay engaged in a task, and where the task gets too great and getting outside and needs you to step in to kind of help. And if we look at that from, you know, our individual interactions, we have a lot of models to kind of help us with that. Really, we're taking this and putting it on the organization or on our team, but it's really the same process that we're looking at, is that collectively, we often push ourselves outside of our capacity to integrate our experience in an effective way and get to our goals. And as a leader, it's my job to, in some ways, not just go out there with you, but to help you to, in some ways, stay within what I have learned about my team, about their window of tolerance, and help help eventually to expand that, where their ability to regulate themselves increases and my need to, in some ways, jump in and help decreases over time. And heart rate variability is an important component of what we just talked about. So, my thoughts are always, how do we integrate these pieces? And now we're on leadership, but we don't all of a sudden stop doing all the things we talked about for how many sessions? 70?
73, this is 74.
Right, this is now taking it to another level.
I remember you're reminding me of a really good friend that I had who I became his supervisor. And we had these really great discussions. He was just such a value.
Do I know this person?
Yeah, of course you do. I hope he's listening because he'll probably know him. We used to have these conversations about balancing my urge to always want to learn and get the group better at the work that we did so that it wasn't so overwhelming, and his urge to want to talk about the difficulty of it and have emotional support around the group. And I really only learned that because I screwed it up. But thank goodness I had somebody who would tell me that, right? Like, that was really important, that I had somebody who could tell me when I was misattuned to
And you listened.
And to my credit, I listened. And it's to this day, it still goes that way. And I still look for that person who will tell me that I'm misattuned to the needs of the group and we need to adjust and we need to spend a little more time around social and emotional support more than learning and skill development and task-oriented kind of things. But that's something that I have to kind of depend on my team for in this kind of interdependent way, right? These are people that I'm their boss and I depend on them so that I can get it right. I think as much or more than they depend on me to get it right. And so I think that's one of the really key takeaways of this kind of article too, is that it's complicated enough that you need your whole team, regardless of what your position is, to be able to manage the complexity of a living system of an organization. So I'm really grateful to that friend who would do that for me. And I hope other people have that too.
This process we're getting is, Matt, you talked about the business literature didn't have it. Well, in a way, psychology was dissociated, right? So there were people who held the affect, there were people who held the cognitions, there were people who held the behavior, and all of those are really important components. And it was really, in some ways, some of the neuroscientists that began to identify how to integrate this stuff, to kind of looking at some of it. So, I think what we hope to kind of be able to do is move to some more comprehensive understanding of how all this, from getting something dysregulated internally, to having an affect state, to having a tendency to be able to think about what are my options and simulate these behaviors out in the world, and then to actually engage in a behavior, and then to evaluate that behavior. Was it effective in me? Right? It isn't like just a behavior or just a cognition or just the emotion. And it's all being driven by physiological states. So when we can have these kind of dialogues, it really helps us to walk away with a more integrated, comprehensive understanding of what are really complex processes.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that, behaviors?
You've been quiet for a minute. Not like you. Making me anxious, man.
Jerry said behaviors. That's your territory.
Well, I thought, when I was reading that, back to that question, I was imagining you asking me, like, what do you think about emotional contagion and collective affect? With that little grin on your face that's like evil. Like, can you make this behavior?
You chose the article too. You chose I could have chose a better one in my opinion, but you did choose this.
So one of the things
Finally, we stop suffocating people, though. I appreciate a break from suffocating.
I think that experiment may have induced a negative affective state in her.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think is so important about this concept is that there's, in terms of these action states or action tendencies that emotions generate, the vast majority of them are probably not cognitive, right? Many of them are things that we aren't thinking of. So one of the things that the article talked about was changes in facial expressiveness. And take this right back to polyvagal theory, right? That the way that our facial expressions changes starts to generate affect in others. And we get this kind of emotional convergence around a specific emotion, and especially from somebody who is of high social status in the group. Right? So that's a really important part of leadership and about interdependent relationships within these groups, and how a mechanism by which emotional contagion can happen, which is a very observable thing that we tend to pay a lot of attention to. Faces, eyes. Like, we pay a lot of attention to that. It gives us a lot of information about our immediate context, and we're very responsive to it. And that's both the input from our own innervations in our face to our own affective state, and our responsiveness to others' facial expressions. So it has kind of this double effect that if we start to mimic what others do with their faces, we start to feel what that face was. Right? So that's a mechanism for transmitting these emotional states across a wide variety of individuals, especially, as the article says, from a leadership perspective. You can have a big impact on a group because of the social status that a leader has. Your affective state can easily get transmitted to a wide group of people right through your face, like right through your eyes. And we all kind of know that. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I do watch people's eyes. Like, what I read, things that infer internal states based on eyes and faces. And that's a really big part of our social structure.
So Curt, let me throw a thought experiment at you here and see. I'd be interested in your take. So when I train on, especially the contagious nature of emotions, and you can go back. I'll give a very simple. I like to use a cup analogy of, when our stress is manageable, we have room between the level of stress in our cup being the water and the top of our cup or our capacity, kind of is the window of tolerance where we can engage cognitively in our work. We know, if you look at so many of the environments, again, whether you're a clinic, a treatment center, a school, so many cups of the folks that we walk into are spilling everywhere just because of trauma, inability to emotionally regulate. And we get pain to the, some of the most extreme, suicidal, self-harm, addiction. We get these extremes every day. I think about folks working at a homeless shelter, for example. Like, you can't get, maybe we could figure it out, but you've got cups spilling everywhere. And one of the ways we keep healthy, what we used to call therapeutic milieus, and some people still do, but create healthy environments, is we help those people whose oftentimes cups are full or overflowing, help regulate that. Now, in my model, I say, we take on, I like to call this empathetic intensity. Connecting with that cup goes somewhere when it's spilling. And I just like, as a visual, is that we kind of catch that in our cup. We hear the painful stories, and that impacts us. Now, if we're healthy, self-care and everything, we've got a lot of room throughout the day to take in these emotions and not have it negatively impact us. But what I see a lot of times is the emotions that walk through our doors spill into our cups. And, anywhere within that organizational structure, if staff's cup starts spilling, then there's a lot of behaviors that come out of it. So I want to just kind of think about, okay, we talk a lot about behaviors resulting from trauma and emotional regulation. From your behavioral perspective, how do you look at, okay, a lot of staff behavior that might involve a write-up to human services? Especially, I think we've all probably seen staff do things that we knew in their best self they would not do. So that we have all these behaviors organizationally, especially if there's emotional dysregulation within the organization. How do you start to address that? Because just putting and I'm simplifying it, and I apologize because I even feel bad doing this to you. A reward or punishment is not going to impact the stress I'm carrying around in my cup. So how do you look from a behavioral perspective as a leader, the behaviors that are coming out of maybe secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, burnout, where people aren't acting in the way they would if their stress was managed?
I mean, I think what you're talking about, if I'm understanding everything that you're meaning correctly, is that internal states can change the function of behavior. Right. So, and this is involving some perceptual components to what we do, right? So when we talk about the tendency to interpret signals with a bias towards interpreting them as threatening, happens as we move up the arousal continuum. So lower on the stress response, you're more likely to, as this article says, you're more likely to use thorough and flexible amounts of information to make a better decision than you would if you're up the arousal continuum or in an alarm state. Yeah. So I think putting that kind of a lens onto it, I mean, I don't know that there's a right answer to that question ultimately, other than to be aware that states have an impact on behavioral function and that might be useful in how you design your response to what happened, both at the client level and at a staff management level. I think it gives you a more well-rounded approach to even how you may design a recognition system, right? That may be an important part of going into that. Like even so if emotion regulation and emotional labor is a part of what you want to recognize, then our ability to do that changes with emotional states. And we may want to incorporate that into how we design that kind of a recognition system. Or on a moment-to-moment basis, we may want to watch for those things. I think one of the things that the article pointed out well is that leaders who are emotionally intelligent and are high in trait positive affectivity are more likely to notice positive affective states and recognize them, which generates more of them down the road. And that's a very like behavioral feedback kind of process that happens that pulls more positive affectivity among a workplace culture and among a team based on the leader's trait of positive affectivity. So that's kind of a roundabout long answer to that, but I think that's an important thing to both design into our kind of treatment environment and into our workplace culture, is a recognition of how affective states and how the stress response changes those, which impacts our decision making in those kinds of moments.
Well, and I think that's important too, because I mean, I think a lot of times we give a lot, and this is tough. I mean, what I'm going to say next, I think is one of the real challenges of leading in the organizations we're talking about, is that we'll look at a behavior from a client, student, patient, and if we take a breath, okay, they didn't wake up this morning planning out that behavior. And trauma gives us a lens to be more patient, more compassionate with that behavior. That behavior is not that person, but I think it gets really hard when we have staff, sometimes coworkers, whoever it might be, doing things that are also very stress reactive, maybe even trauma. If my definition of basically secondary trauma is a re-traumatization of the helper, these are stress or traumatic responses. And boy, does a leader, a teammate, whoever's trying to support that person need to think, really put on their trauma-informed lens to say, okay, yeah, this is not an acceptable behavior, just like the client behavior, but okay, what happened to this person? We can't, just because we pay this person to do a job, we have to balance that. Again, we've got to get things done. That's why we get grant money or whatever to do it. But this is I think some of the really challenges, because we almost every day take a bucket of stress if we're working with traumatized people and dump it on that organizational chart. And, again, it's just like, I think starting at some point, I don't mean this in a negative way, but thinking about your organization from a stress-based perspective. Where's the stress enter? And thinking about it, because then I think it gives us points for wellness interventions for our staff, just like we would for the clients we work with. And, I saw that, part of my job was making sure I had the most emotionally healthy workforce I can do and hopefully get them productive and balance those eventually as well. But I think thinking about it from a stress-based perspective gives us a realistic view of taking this article. I like to think about turning that organizational chart upside down. So you've got all the clients, students, whoever walks through the door every day. You've got your direct care people and then your levels of leadership. and basically just dumping a whole bunch of water onto all those cups, because that's the work we do. And so acknowledging that, and then really, again, this is why hyper-focus on self-care, hyper-focus on supportive supervision allows us to do maybe even just an adequate job of what we're trying to do. But just acknowledging, very few people write books. Just tell somebody working in a manager in an emergency room or a child welfare facility how to do this effectively. And I think I think recognizing that and say, okay, collectively as our collective fields, and I know this is what we're going to be exploring. How do we maintain health and wellness in being in this ocean of stress sometimes and trauma that we're dealing with? I sound like Jerry there.
That's why I'm quiet.
My late podcast Jerry ran. Not nearly as intelligent, but hey.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that might be. I think we'll go on for this for obviously. So hopefully our listeners get a gist of the excitement we have for this topic. I think the first 73 episodes. I mean, it's amazing thing. 73 hours of podcasting we've been doing, I think sets this up in a lot of ways for putting this lens on our organizations, programs, teams, and ourselves as well. So a good reminder, take care of yourself in this, take care of each other. And we'll continue our exploration of this topic for several weeks. Curt gave us a whole bunch of articles to look at. So as always, you can find, I put some discussion questions up, resources at traumainformedlens.org. If you've not seen us in video lately, I kind of shaved this week. I realized it's still kind of ugly underneath, so it'll probably grow back. Curt looks like the freaking Wolverine. I am so jealous of his facial hair. So I don't know how long he's going to keep it because he usually changes it up. But I like the Wolverine look. 2 thumbs up. So.
Thanks, Matt.
Yes, everybody go, and I know nobody ever really, a few people will comment sometimes, but I want comments on Curt's beard. So, as always, you can find show notes, resources, discussion questions at traumainformedlens.org. Our schedules get crazy busy for the next week or so, so we're going to take a week off next week. But then we'll be back with new episodes around leadership. So everybody have a great week, and we'll see you in 2. Take care. Bye.